With your latest news, I'm April Cummings. Deputy Premier and Tourism Minister, the Honorable Moses Kirkconnell, announces the extension of the tourism stipend for displaced tourism workers.
Since we're not yet at the stage where we can safely reopen our borders to tourists, I'm very pleased to confirm that the ministry will be extending the stipend payments for an additional 6 months from January to June of 2021, which we estimate will be another $18 million based on the number registered now.
In Parliament, Minister Kirkconnell said government has already spent more than $15.6 million on the program to help displaced workers through the financial hardships posed by the COVID-19 suppression efforts which closed the island's borders. As we speak, many of our source market cities are re-entering lockdowns, are renewing restrictions to try to curtail the virus's spread. This paints a bleak picture in terms of when we will likely be able to bring back tourism. Expressing optimism because of the vaccination program, Minister Kirkconnell says the vaccine will help us pave the way toward the return of the tourism industry. A group calling for a plan to reopen the borders weighs in on the Premier's announcement about the program in Parliament Thursday. Dr. Michael Tibbetts of Clearly Cayman Resorts is one of the founders of ReopenCayman.com. He is also a medical doctor. He spoke with me via Zoom earlier today. You and others have been calling for a plan to reopen. This speech from the Premier talks about the plan for the vaccine program, but also addresses to a degree a reopening plan. What are your thoughts on what you've heard so far?
Well, the news that Cayman will be receiving the vaccine in early January is fantastic. And the approach to vaccinating the elderly, the most vulnerable frontline workers, certainly makes a lot of sense in line with what the UK is doing and likely what the US will be doing. And I think that should certainly reduce the risk to the Cayman population if, in fact, there was someone infected on island, whether that be from the current situation with residents in quarantine or somehow the virus was introduced. So I think that is first tremendously good news. However, the policy to require vaccination in order to avoid quarantine really isn't a viable pathway to reopening for the next several months.
Dr. Tibbetts says there are many unresolved questions with regard to the vaccines that need to be addressed to make it a viable policy.
For example, we do not have any data from clinical trials on the safety and efficacy of vaccinating children. And that data will likely not come out until late summer, likely September or so of next year, meaning that under this policy, a child would be required to be quarantined, be isolated upon arrival until that time. We also know that we don't have safety and efficacy data in women who are pregnant or the 20 to 30% likely of the US population that has had COVID-19. We also don't know how long the vaccinations will last. Is it 3 months like the clinical trials, or is it 30 years? And then also, how do they compare to one another? Is it the same policy if someone received the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine that's 70% effective versus the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines, which are more than 90% effective? There's certainly a different risk for someone to be infected depending on what vaccine they have. So these are some of the unresolved questions that would need to be addressed to really make it a viable path for people to come back, for visitors to come back and avoid quarantine.
Dr. Tibbetts says the other big issue is the availability of the vaccine in the U.S. and UK, and he says it is unlikely that healthy individuals under the age of 50 or 60 will be vaccinated before June, which would prevent a large number of people from coming to the islands. He's posted more information online at ReopenCayman.com. Core government ended the third quarter of the year with $2.5 billion in assets and $900,000 in total liabilities, leading to $1.6 billion in net worth.
Mr. Speaker, public debt for the core government stood at $261.4 million at the 30th of September 2020. This was $143.2 million lower than the debt balance at the 30th of September 2019. Therefore, government's debt has been reduced by that amount over the 1 year period, and will continue to be reduced with regularly scheduled principal repayments.
Finance Minister the Honourable Roy McTaggart tabled the unaudited quarterly financial report for core government for the 9-month period that ended September 30th, 2020 in Parliament this week.
The statement of financial performance for the period shows that core government earned total operating revenues of $604.5 million and incurred total operating expenditures of $574.1 million in the period. Resulting operating surplus for core government was $30.4 million.
Mr. McTaggart told MPs the entire public sector produced an operating surplus of $32.1 million for the quarter, 62% below budget, and the revenue recorded for the first 9 months of 2020 was $68.1 million below budget. This was mainly in the category of coercive revenue.
The significant decline in revenues is directly attributed to the effect of COVID-19 on the economy, with one such area being the closure of the borders to international travel and tourism. Coercive revenue items performing below budget expectations include work permit fees of $28.9 million, tourist accommodation charges $17.8 million, or 64% less than expected for the period, other import duties $16.6 million less than budgeted, cruise ship departure charges of $5.3 million, 62% below budget, and gasoline and diesel duty $4.5 million less than expected revenue for the period.
These were partially offset positive variances in other revenue items like stamp duty on land transfers and mutual fund administration fees. Expenses incurred for the period of $574 million were, quote, right on line with budget expectations. The Cayman Islands is being considered as a location for filming a reality TV show, and a 4-person crew is visiting the islands to scout potential locations. Radio Cayman's Paula Cowell has more.
Officials say the crew was tested for COVID-19 prior to their departure via private aircraft. During their brief stay on island, they will be housed in a government-approved isolation facility, and all members of the crew will require a negative result from their PCR test on arrival in order to carry out their work as planned.
This is one of many efforts being undertaken by government in a sustained effort to promote economic recovery as vaccine availability widens and Cayman's economy returns to normal.
Chief Medical Officer Dr. John Lee tells Radio Cayman there are exceptions to the mandatory isolation protocol.
While inbound travel remains restricted, government has granted exceptions to mandatory quarantine in order that we accommodate professionals and engineers whose services are essential to maintain critical infrastructure. Stringent protocols have been in place to safeguard the public, and this occasion is no different.
The on-island logistics for the trip have been approved by the CMO and will be managed jointly by the Department of Environmental Health and the Ministry of International Trade, Investment, Aviation and Maritime Affairs, as well as Travel Cayman. While here today and tomorrow, the crew will visit a limited number of outdoor locations during the day and view a set of unoccupied vacation residences, all on an agreed itinerary. The crew will travel together in their own rental car, escorted by representatives from DEH and MITIAMA, along with private security personnel, all traveling in separate vehicles. The scouting crew members will not be allowed to interact with members of the public, nor will they patronize any public or private establishment. When they are not being escorted on their scouting trip on Friday and Saturday, they will be in isolation in their accommodation. They depart early Sunday morning. For Radio Cayman News, I'm Paula Cowell.
And we take you out of the news tonight with the students from Lighthouse School who filled the lobby of the Government Administration Building with some fabulous Christmas carols.
Joy to the world, the Lord has come. There to receive the King.